Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not a story about a plant. This is not a story about smoking or addiction or even public health. This is a story about how a single molecule, smaller than a grain of sand, invisible to the naked eye, managed to reshape the course of human civilization. It is a story about empires built on dried leaves, about fortunes made while bodies crumbled, about governments that knew the truth and chose profit over people, about scientists who were silenced, whistleblowers who were destroyed, and billions of lives that were shortened, sometimes by years, sometimes by decades, all in service of a substance that is, by any reasonable definition, a poison. Nicotine, the most legal poison in human history. Tonight we will trace this molecule's journey from sacred ritual to global pandemic. We will meet the emperors who banned it and the presidents who profited from it. We will walk through laboratories where its deadly nature was first discovered and boardrooms where that truth was buried. We will count the bodies, tens of millions of them, perhaps hundreds of millions over the centuries, more than any war, more than any plague, all from a plant that was once considered a gift from the gods. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find this kind of deep historical exploration valuable. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply seeking understanding, you're welcome here. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was a plant. It grew in the shadows of what we now call the Andes Mountains in the fertile valleys of South America, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. The indigenous peoples of that land had no written language, so we cannot know their first words upon discovering its effects. But we can piece together what happened next through archaeology, through pollen samples and preserved pipes, through the careful study of ancient human remains. The plant was Nicotiana rustica, a wild variety with leaves thick and green, covered in fine, sticky hairs that trapped the morning dew. It grew in patches, unremarkable among the countless other species that flourished in those tropical lowlands. But someone, at some point, discovered something extraordinary. Perhaps it was an accident. Perhaps someone fell asleep near a burning pile of vegetation and inhaled the smoke. Perhaps the leaves were chewed out of hunger during a famine. We will never know the exact moment. What we know is the result. The effect was unlike anything they had experienced, a rush of clarity followed by a strange calm, a sharpening of the senses coupled with a loosening of the body. The shamans, the spiritual leaders of these ancient communities, recognized immediately that they had found something sacred. Here was a plant that bridged the world of the living and the world of spirits. Here was a tool for communing with ancestors, for seeing visions, for healing the sick and cursing the enemy. The first chapter of this story takes us to these early civilizations, scattered across what we now call Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Archaeological evidence suggests that tobacco use was established in South America by at least 5,000 BCE, possibly earlier. Stone pipes have been recovered from sites dating to this period, their bowls still stained with the ancient residue of tobacco. Mummified human remains show traces of nicotine metabolites in their hair and tissues, proving that consumption was not occasional but regular, perhaps daily. The plant spread. through trade routes carved into mountain passes, through wars that shifted territorial boundaries, through the simple movement of peoples across landscapes, tobacco made its way north. By 3000 BCE, it had reached Central America. By 1000 BCE, it was being cultivated by the ancestors of the Maya in what is now Guatemala and southern Mexico. The Maya would become the first great tobacco civilization, integrating the plant into every aspect of their culture. To understand what tobacco meant to the Maya, you must forget everything you know about modern smoking. There were no cigarettes, no casual puffs on street corners, no nicotine patches. Tobacco was divine. The Maya believed that their gods had created the plant specifically to communicate with humanity. Smoking was a religious act performed during ceremonies by priests who would blow smoke toward the 4 cardinal directions, each puff carrying prayers to the heavens. The smoke was visible breath, visible spirit, a physical manifestation of the soul's communication with the divine. The archaeological record at sites like Palenque and Tikal reveals elaborate smoking implements made from jade and obsidian, too precious for common use. Ceramic figurines depict gods and priests with cigars in their mouths or holding ornate smoking tubes. Wall paintings show scenes of ritual smoking, the participants' eyes rolled back in trance states induced by the powerful nicotine content of the ancient varieties. These were not the mild tobaccos of modern cigarettes. Nicotiana rustica contained nicotine concentrations sometimes 10 times higher than the Nicotiana tabacum that would later dominate global markets. A single inhalation could produce effects approaching psychedelic intensity. But the Maya did not only smoke tobacco, they drank it, mixing the leaves with lime and water to create a thick, bitter liquid that was consumed during divination rituals. They applied it to wounds, believing it would draw out evil spirits that caused infection. They blew tobacco smoke into the ears of the sick to cure headaches. They rubbed tobacco paste on the gums of teething infants to ease their pain. In every case, they were, unknowingly, delivering nicotine directly into the bloodstream, exploiting the molecule's ability to cross membranes and reach the brain within seconds. The Maya civilization would eventually decline, fragmented by drought and warfare, but tobacco survived. It passed to the Aztecs, who called it yetl and incorporated it into their own imperial rituals. It traveled to the Caribbean islands, where the Taino people developed the practice of rolling dried leaves into tubes for easier smoking. And it spread northward into the lands that would become the United States, where it found its way into the cultures of hundreds of distinct indigenous nations. Among the Cherokee, tobacco was the first plant that was given the power of speech. Their creation stories tell of a time when the Great Spirit distributed gifts to all living things, and tobacco alone received the ability to carry messages between the human world and the spirit world. The Lakota Sioux used tobacco in the sacred pipe ceremony, the Chanumpa, where the smoke was believed to carry prayers directly to Wakan Tanka, the Great Mystery. The Haudenosaunee, known to Europeans as the Iroquois, included tobacco in their condolence ceremonies, using its smoke to clear the minds of the grieving and restore balance to communities fractured by death. What strikes the modern observer looking back across these millennia of indigenous tobacco use, is the almost universal recognition of the plant's power. These were not cultures that treated tobacco casually. They understood, in their own frameworks, that they were handling something potent, something that demanded respect, something that could help or harm depending on how it was used. The dosages were controlled by tradition, the contexts were controlled by ritual, the access was controlled by social structures that limited use to specific occasions, specific people, specific purposes. This system had existed for thousands of years. It was stable, sustainable, and it was about to be destroyed. The second chapter of our story begins with a date that every school child knows, October 12th, 1492. On that morning, Christopher Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria and watched the coastline of a new world materialize from the morning mist. He had not found Asia, though he would go to his grave believing he had. He had found the Caribbean, specifically the island that the Taino people called Guanahani, which he promptly renamed San Salvador. Columbus was interested in gold. He was interested in spices. He was interested in any commodity that would justify the extraordinary expense of his expedition and satisfy the expectations of his royal patrons, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. He was not, initially, interested in the dried leaves that the Taino offered him as gifts. His log from those first days describes his confusion at receiving bundles of brown vegetation that seemed to have no obvious value. But Columbus was nothing if not observant, and in the weeks that followed, he began to notice something peculiar. The indigenous peoples of these islands were constantly putting fire to these leaves and inhaling the smoke. They carried tubes made from hollowed cane, which they called tabacos, and they inserted these leaves into the tubes and set them alight. They seemed to derive great pleasure from this practice, performing it multiple times per day, sometimes appearing agitated if they went too long without it. Two members of Columbus's crew, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, were sent to explore the interior of Cuba and returned with a remarkable report. They had observed men and women walking about with smoldering rolls of leaves, breathing in the smoke and exhaling it through their mouths and nostrils. They are called tabacos, the sailors explained, and they admitted that they had tried the practice themselves. They had found it deeply enjoyable, so much so that Rodrigo de Jerez had continued the habit throughout the remainder of the voyage. When Rodrigo returned to his hometown of Ayamonte in Spain, still smoking his tobacco rolls, his neighbors were horrified. Here was a man breathing fire and smoke, exhaling clouds from his mouth like some kind of demon. The Spanish Inquisition was summoned. Rodrigo de Jerez was arrested on charges of consorting with the devil and was imprisoned for 7 years. By the time he was released, smoking had become a fashionable habit among Spanish aristocrats. The world had changed without him. However, the true transformation of tobacco from indigenous sacrament to global commodity would not happen immediately. It would take decades of experimentation, failed ventures, and fortunate discoveries. It would require the involvement of empires, the displacement of populations, and the enslavement of millions. And it would begin, in earnest, with a French diplomat named Jean-Nicot. Jean-Nicot de Villemonnet was an ambassador, a scholar, and an amateur botanist who arrived in Lisbon, Portugal in 1559. His official purpose was to negotiate a marriage between the 6-year-old King Sebastian of Portugal and Marguerite of Valois, a daughter of the French royal family. The negotiations would ultimately fail, but during his time in Lisbon, Nicot became fascinated by a plant that Portuguese traders had brought back from their Brazilian colonies. The Portuguese called it erba sancta, the holy herb, because of its reputed medicinal properties. Local physicians claimed it could cure headaches, heal wounds, reduce inflammation, and treat a bewildering variety of ailments. Nicot was skeptical at first, but he began conducting his own experiments. He applied tobacco poultices to the skin ulcers of his servants and noted marked improvement. He gave tobacco snuff to patients suffering from migraines and recorded their relief. He became convinced that he had discovered a panacea, a miracle cure that would revolutionize European medicine. In 1560, Nicot sent a package of tobacco seeds and plants to the French royal court, along with detailed instructions for their cultivation and use. He recommended the herb particularly for Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, who suffered from persistent headaches that no treatment had been able to cure. Catherine tried the tobacco snuff. Her headaches improved. She became an enthusiastic advocate, and suddenly tobacco had the endorsement of one of the most powerful women in Europe. The plant was renamed in Nicot's honor. Carl Linnaeus, the great Swedish botanist, would later formalize this when he classified the tobacco genus as Nicotiana. And when German chemists isolated the primary active compound from tobacco leaves in 1828, they called it nicotine, ensuring that Jean Nicot's name would be forever associated with one of the most addictive substances known to science. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the decades following Nicot's gift to the French court, tobacco spread across Europe with astonishing speed. Spanish galleons carried it to their colonies in the Philippines, from where it traveled to China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Portuguese traders brought it to their outposts in India and Africa. English merchants acquired seeds and plants and began experimental cultivation in their own territories. By 1600, tobacco was being grown, traded, and consumed on every inhabited continent. The third chapter reveals a peculiar phenomenon that accompanied tobacco's global spread. Everywhere it went, authorities tried to ban it, and everywhere authorities tried to ban it, they failed. Consider the case of King James I of England, who ascended to the throne in 1603 with a burning hatred of tobacco smoke. In 1604, he published A Counterblast to Tobacco, one of the most eloquent condemnations of smoking ever written. The king called tobacco loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He mocked smokers who claimed health benefits, asking why, if tobacco was so medicinal, the indigenous peoples of America were not immortal. He described the habit as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. In the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless. King James did not stop at rhetoric. He imposed taxes on tobacco imports so heavy that they amounted to a de facto prohibition. The price of tobacco increased by 4,000% overnight. Smuggling became rampant. The taxes raised little revenue because legal trade all but ceased. After 7 years of failure, James quietly reduced the taxes to more reasonable levels. He had learned what every subsequent government would learn. People would pay almost any price, bear almost any burden to maintain their access to nicotine. Similar patterns emerged across the world. In 1633, the Ottoman Sultan Murad IV decreed that tobacco smoking was punishable by death. His enforcers patrolled the streets of Constantinople, executing smokers on sight, sometimes by beheading, sometimes by hanging, sometimes by more creative means. Estimates suggest that Murad executed up to 18 smokers per day during his reign. Yet even this extraordinary brutality failed to eliminate the habit. When Murad died in 1640, at the age of 27, reportedly from complications of alcoholism, tobacco smoking resumed immediately and openly. In Russia, Tsar Michael I banned tobacco in 1634. The penalty for a first offense was whipping. For a second offense, the nose was slit or removed entirely. For a third offense, execution. His successor, Alexis I, maintained the prohibition. Yet by 1697, when Peter the Great took power after spending time in Western Europe, where smoking was fashionable, he reversed the ban entirely and began promoting tobacco use as a sign of modernization. In China, the Ming Dynasty banned tobacco in 1638 with severe penalties, including decapitation. The ban was spectacularly ineffective. When the Qing Dynasty overthrew the Ming in 1644, they initially attempted to maintain the prohibition, then abandoned it when they realized that tobacco had become too deeply embedded in Chinese culture to eradicate. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate issued 5 separate bans on tobacco between 1603 and 1616. Each ban was stricter than the last. Each ban failed more thoroughly than the last. By 1625, the government had given up and focused instead on regulating and taxing the trade. What were authorities fighting against? They did not understand nicotine as a chemical compound. They could not explain the mechanism of addiction, but they observed its effects clearly enough. They saw that people who smoked tobacco once wanted to smoke it again, that people who smoked it regularly became agitated and irritable when denied access, that people would prioritize tobacco over food, over clothing, over the most basic necessities of life. They were witnessing, without the vocabulary to describe it, the power of chemical dependency. Moving into the colonial era, we find tobacco not merely surviving, but thriving, becoming the economic foundation of empires. Nowhere was this more evident than in the English colony of Virginia, established at Jamestown in 1607. The first years at Jamestown were catastrophic. The colonists died of disease, starvation, and conflict with the Indigenous Powhatan Confederacy. By 1610, only 60 of the original 500 settlers remained alive. The colony was on the verge of abandonment when a young planter named John Rolfe made a discovery that would change everything. Rolfe had obtained seeds of Nicotiana tabacum, a sweeter, milder variety of tobacco that Spanish colonists were growing in the Caribbean. He planted them in Virginia soil and found that they flourished. The resulting leaf was far more palatable to European tastes than the harsh native varieties. In 1614, Rolfe shipped his first cargo of Virginia tobacco to England. It sold immediately. The demand was insatiable. Within a decade, tobacco had transformed Virginia from a failing experiment into a profitable enterprise. Colonists planted tobacco in every available space, including the streets of Jamestown, the cemeteries, the spaces between buildings. The crop was so valuable that it served as currency. Workers were paid in tobacco. Taxes were assessed in tobacco. When shiploads of young women arrived from England to become wives to the colonists, the men paid for them in tobacco, 120 pounds of leaf for each bride. But tobacco cultivation required labor, enormous amounts of labor, for planting, tending, harvesting, curing, and shipping. The indigenous population had been decimated by European diseases and was, in any case, hostile to the colonizers. English indentured servants could be imported, but they served only for a term of years and then demanded their own land. The The solution, if we can call something so monstrous a solution, was African slavery. The first documented Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, sold from a Portuguese slave ship that had been captured by English privateers. Their legal status was initially ambiguous, but by the 1660s, Virginia had enacted laws establishing hereditary chattel slavery. By 1800, enslaved Africans constituted the majority of Virginia's agricultural workforce. By 1860, there were 4 million enslaved people in the American South, the vast majority of them producing tobacco or cotton. The human cost is almost impossible to calculate. The Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas, killed an estimated 2 million people from its inception to its abolition. Those who survived faced lifetimes of forced labor, families torn apart, bodies broken by work and violence. All of this to produce a commodity that existed solely to deliver nicotine to the brains of consumers an ocean away. But here we must pause and introduce a shadow that had been present all along, though it would take centuries to be properly understood. Even as tobacco brought wealth to some and devastation to others, it was exacting its own price on the bodies of those who used it. The 4th chapter takes us into the laboratories and hospitals where the true nature of nicotine began to be revealed. The first scientific isolation of nicotine occurred in 1828 when 2 German chemists, Wilhelm Heinrich Posselt and Carl Ludwig Riemann, succeeded in extracting the pure compound from tobacco leaves. They named it nicotine after Jean Nicot, and they immediately recognized that they had isolated something dangerous. In concentrated form, nicotine was acutely toxic. A few drops applied to the skin of laboratory animals caused convulsions and death. Ingestion was even lethal. The toxicological profile of nicotine is remarkable. The lethal dose for an adult human is estimated between 30 and 60 milligrams, though some research suggests it may be higher. This makes nicotine more acutely poisonous than arsenic, more dangerous than cyanide. A single cigarette contains roughly 10 to 14 milligrams of nicotine, though most of this is destroyed during combustion, and only 1 to 2 milligrams is actually absorbed by the smoker. Still, the margin between effective dose and lethal dose is narrow, far narrower than for most recreational substances. Throughout the 19th century, tobacco was used as a pesticide and occasionally as a murder weapon. In 1850, a Belgian count named Hippolyte Missard de Beaucarmé killed his brother-in-law with nicotine extracted from tobacco leaves, hoping to claim an inheritance. A pioneering toxicologist named Jean Servais-Stas developed a method to detect the alkaloid in tissue samples and secured the count's conviction. It was one of the first cases in which modern toxicological methods were used to solve a murder. But the chronic effects of tobacco, as opposed to acute nicotine poisoning, remained poorly understood. Physicians in the 1800s observed that tobacco users seemed to suffer higher rates of various ailments, but they lacked the epidemiological tools to prove causation. Some doctors recommended tobacco for its supposed calming effects. Others warned against its dangers. There was no consensus, no definitive evidence that could settle the debate. The transformation of tobacco consumption in the late 19th century would make that evidence impossible to ignore, but it would take decades before science caught up with the carnage. What happened next would shock the world. In 1881, a young Virginian inventor named James Albert Bonsack patented a machine that could roll cigarettes faster than any human hand. Previous attempts at cigarette-making machines had failed, but Bonsack's design worked. It could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day, the equivalent of 48 skilled hand rollers at maximum speed. A tobacco manufacturer named James Buchanan Duke saw the potential immediately. Duke purchased the rights to Bonsack's machine and began mass-producing cigarettes at his factory in Durham, North Carolina. The reduction in production costs was extraordinary. Cigarettes that had previously cost 3 to 4 times as much as cigars could now be sold for less than cigars. The market exploded. Duke was not merely an industrialist, he was a marketing genius. He plastered cities with advertisements. He included collectible cards in his cigarette packages, featuring images of athletes, actresses, and exotic locations. He distributed free samples to soldiers, knowing that men at war craved any comfort they could find and would become lifelong customers. By 1890, the American Tobacco Company, Duke's consolidated monopoly, controlled 90% of the American cigarette market. The transformation in smoking patterns was dramatic. In 1870, the average American adult consumed fewer than 40 cigarettes per year. By 1900, it was 54. By 1910, it was 138. By 1930, it was 1,365. By 1960, it would peak at 4,171 cigarettes per adult per year, or more than 11 per day on average. Similar patterns emerged across the developed world. In Britain, cigarette consumption rose from 10 million in 1880 to 8 billion by 1914. In Germany, in France, in Japan, in Australia, wherever industrialization had created urban populations with disposable income, cigarette smoking became ubiquitous. The First World War accelerated this trend dramatically. Military authorities distributed cigarettes to soldiers as part of their rations, believing that smoking improved morale and calmed nerves. General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in Europe, famously declared, "You ask me what we need to win this war? I answer tobacco as much as bullets." By the war's end, millions of young men had acquired smoking habits they would carry for the rest of their shortened lives. The tobacco industry had discovered something that would serve it well for decades to come. Nothing created customers quite like war. However, the shadow was lengthening, the evidence was accumulating, and by the 1930s it was becoming impossible to ignore. In 1929, a German physician named Fritz Lickent published a statistical analysis showing a striking correlation between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. His work attracted little attention outside Germany, partly because of the political circumstances of the time, partly because the global medical community was not yet ready to accept such a devastating conclusion. In 1939, another German researcher, Franz Hermann Müller, conducted the first case control study linking smoking to lung cancer. He compared the smoking histories of lung cancer patients to those of healthy controls and found that smokers were dramatically overrepresented among the cancer cases. His work was published in a German medical journal and was largely forgotten after the war, buried along with other Nazi-era science. The decisive studies came after the Second World War, conducted independently by researchers in the United States and Britain. In 1950, Ernst Winder and Everts Graham published their landmark paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, reporting that among 684 lung cancer patients they had studied, 96.5% were heavy smokers. That same year, Richard Dahl and A. Bradford Hill published similar findings in the British Medical Journal based on interviews with 649 lung cancer patients in London hospitals. The reaction of the tobacco industry to these findings is one of the darkest chapters in corporate history. Rather than accept the evidence and take responsibility, the major manufacturers banded together to fund a campaign of doubt and denial that would continue for nearly half a century. In 1954, the tobacco companies published the frank statement to cigarette smokers in newspapers across America. They pledged to cooperate with scientists investigating the health effects of tobacco. They established the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, ostensibly to fund independent research into smoking and health. In reality, the committee's purpose was to generate confusion, to produce studies that questioned the emerging consensus, to provide ammunition for those who wanted to believe that smoking was not as dangerous as the evidence suggested. Internal documents, later released through litigation, reveal the industry's strategy with chilling clarity. A 1969 memo from a Brown and Williamson executive stated, "Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy." Another document from the same period noted that the cigarette should be conceived not as a product, but as a package. The product is nicotine. They knew. They knew nicotine was addictive. They knew their products caused cancer, heart disease, emphysema, stroke. They knew they were killing their own customers, and they continued anyway, because the profits were too vast to abandon, because the addiction was too powerful to escape. As we approach the modern age, we must reckon with the scale of the tragedy that was unfolding. By the 1960s, approximately 40% of Americans smoked. Similar rates prevailed across Western Europe, Australia, and increasingly in Asia and Latin America. The tobacco industry was generating tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers. It supported entire regional economies. And it was killing people in numbers that dwarfed any epidemic in human history. Consider the statistics for a moment. The World Health Organization estimates that tobacco killed approximately 100 million people during the 20th century, more than both world wars combined, more than the 1918 influenza pandemic, more than HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis put together. Today, tobacco kills approximately 8 million people per year, nearly one death every 4 seconds. By the end of this documentary, roughly 90 minutes from now, tobacco will have killed approximately 1,300 people worldwide. These numbers are so large that they become abstracted, impossible to truly comprehend. So let us pause and consider individual stories, because behind every statistic was a human being, with a name, with a family, with hopes and fears, and a life that was cut short. Consider the story of Rose Cipollone. Rose started smoking at age 16 in 1942, when cigarettes were advertised as sophisticated, healthful, endorsed by doctors. She smoked Chesterfields at first because their advertisements claimed they would never irritate your throat. She switched to L&M, then to Virginia Slims, always following the promises of the advertisements, always believing that somehow, miraculously, her cigarettes were safe. By 1981, Rose had lung cancer. She underwent surgery to remove one lobe of her lung. She continued to smoke. The cancer returned. She underwent more surgery, more chemotherapy. She continued to smoke because by now she could not stop because the addiction was stronger than her will to live. In 1983, with Rose too sick to continue, her husband, Antonio, filed a lawsuit against 3 tobacco companies seeking damages for his wife's illness. Rose testified in her deposition that she had believed the advertisements, that she had trusted the companies, that she had thought, based on everything they told her, that smoking was not really dangerous. She died in 1984, before the case went to trial. Antonio Cipollone continued the lawsuit after his wife's death. It took 4 years to reach trial and another 4 years of appeals. In 1992, the Supreme Court ruled in Cipollone v. Liggett Group that certain tobacco company actions were not protected by federal labeling laws, opening the door for future litigation. But by then, Antonio, too, had died. The family eventually settled for an undisclosed amount. No one would ever be held fully accountable for Rose's death. Consider the story of Wayne McLaren, who appeared in Marlboro advertisements in the 1970s, the very embodiment of rugged masculinity, the cowboy on horseback against the western sunset. In 1992, McLaren died of lung cancer at the age of 51. Before his death, he had become an anti-smoking activist, appearing in public service announcements and testifying before state legislatures. "Tobacco will kill you," he told anyone who would listen, "and I'm living proof." Consider David McLean, another Marlboro man, who died of lung cancer in 1995. Consider Dick Hammer, another Marlboro man, who died of lung cancer in 1999. Consider Eric Lawson, yet another Marlboro man, who died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in 2014. The advertisement had killed its own models. The 5th chapter brings us to the era of reckoning, when governments and courts finally began to hold the tobacco industry accountable for the devastation it had caused. On January 11, 1964, the United States Surgeon General Luther Terry released a report that would change the course of public health history. The report, titled Smoking and Health, Report of the Advisory Committee to the Surgeon General of the United States, concluded definitively that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer in men and was associated with numerous other diseases. It was the culmination of more than a decade of research, the death blow to any remaining doubt about tobacco's deadly effects. The impact of the report was immediate and profound. Cigarette consumption in the United States dropped by 15% in the 2 months following its release. Congress passed the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act, requiring warning labels on all cigarette packages. The Federal Trade Commission banned cigarette advertising on radio and television. Smoking sections appeared in restaurants, then disappeared entirely from airplanes, then from most public spaces. But the industry adapted. What it could no longer advertise openly, it promoted through sponsorships, product placements, and marketing campaigns targeted at young people. Internal documents revealed that the companies understood exactly what they were doing. Today's teenager is tomorrow's potential regular customer, read one Philip Morris memo in 1981. Another document from R.J. Reynolds stated, "Realistically, if our company is to survive and prosper over the long term, we must get our share of the youth market." The companies also expanded aggressively into international markets, particularly in developing countries where regulations were weak or non-existent. As smoking rates declined in the United States and Western Europe, they rose in China, Indonesia, India, Brazil. The global tobacco epidemic was not ending, it was merely shifting locations, finding new populations to exploit, new generations to addict. The next major turning point came in 1994 when Jeffrey Wigand, a former executive at Brown and Williamson, became a whistleblower. Wigand had been the company's head of research and development. He knew things. He knew that the company had suppressed research showing the harmful effects of tobacco. He knew that they had manipulated nicotine levels to make cigarettes more addictive. He knew that they had lied systematically and continuously to the public and to regulators. When Wigand went public with his information, the tobacco industry attempted to destroy him. They hired private investigators to follow him. They dug through his personal history, looking for anything that could discredit him. They threatened him with lawsuits. They spread rumors about his mental stability. They did everything in their considerable power to silence him. It did not work. Wigand's testimony, combined with the release of internal industry documents through litigation, exposed the depth of the tobacco industry's deception. The public learned that the companies had known for decades that their products were addictive and deadly. They learned that the companies had covered up this knowledge while continuing to market their products to children. The moral bankruptcy of the industry was laid bare for all to see. In 1998, the attorneys general of 46 states reached a settlement with the 4 largest tobacco companies. The master settlement agreement required the companies to pay $206 billion over 25 years to compensate states for health care costs associated with smoking-related illnesses. It also imposed restrictions on advertising, marketing, and lobbying. It was the largest civil litigation settlement in American history. Yet even this massive settlement represented only a fraction of the true cost. The companies continued to sell their products. They continued to profit. They continued to kill their customers. The settlement was, in many ways, merely the cost of doing business. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of this history. The tobacco industry has not disappeared. It has merely evolved. The most significant development of the 21st century has been the rise of electronic cigarettes, devices that deliver nicotine through vaporized liquid rather than combusted tobacco. The first commercially successful e-cigarette was invented by Han Lik, a Chinese pharmacist whose father died of lung cancer. Han Lik was a smoker himself, and he wanted to create a safer alternative. He patented his design in 2003 and began selling it in China in 2004. E-cigarettes reached the United States and Europe around 2007 and have since become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Their proponents argue that they are far less harmful than traditional cigarettes, eliminating the tar and carbon monoxide that cause most smoking-related diseases while still delivering the nicotine that smokers crave. If every smoker in the world switched to e-cigarettes, they argued, millions of lives could be saved. However, critics point to troubling trends. E-cigarette use among young people has exploded, creating a new generation addicted to nicotine. Between 2017 and 2019, the percentage of American high school students using e-cigarettes nearly doubled from 11.7% to 27.5%. Many of these young people had never smoked traditional cigarettes and would never have started had e-cigarettes not existed. The nicotine they are consuming may be reshaping their developing brains, potentially creating lifelong patterns of addiction. The emergence of Juul, a sleek USB-shaped e-cigarette that became extraordinarily popular among teenagers. Juul's pods contained nicotine concentrations higher than most other e-cigarettes, delivering doses comparable to traditional cigarettes. The company's early marketing featured young models in hip urban settings, imagery that critics argued was designed to appeal to adolescents. By 2018, Juul controlled more than 70% of the American e-cigarette market and was valued at $38 billion. The regulatory response has been inconsistent and often inadequate. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration gained authority over e-cigarettes in 2016, but has struggled to enforce its rules. Flavored e-cigarettes, which particularly appeal to young people, have been partially restricted but remain available through various loopholes. The long-term health effects of vaping remain poorly understood, though emerging research suggests potential risks to cardiovascular and respiratory health. Meanwhile, traditional cigarette smoking continues worldwide, particularly in developing countries where tobacco companies have found new markets to exploit. China alone has more than 300 million smokers, nearly as many as the entire population of the United States. Indonesia, with minimal tobacco regulation, has some of the highest smoking rates in the world. Across Africa, tobacco companies are investing billions in advertising and distribution, hoping to hook new generations before public health awareness catches up. The global burden of tobacco-related disease is staggering. Approximately 1.3 billion people currently smoke tobacco. Each year, about 8 million die from smoking-related causes, including 1.2 million who die from secondhand smoke exposure. The World Health Organization projects that tobacco will kill 1 billion people during the 21st century if current trends continue. The economics of tobacco remain as troubling as ever. The industry generates more than $800 billion in annual revenue globally. It employs millions of people, from tobacco farmers in Zimbabwe to factory workers in Indonesia to retail clerks in convenience stores everywhere. Governments around the world collect hundreds of billions in tobacco taxes, creating a perverse incentive to maintain rather than reduce consumption. And nicotine itself, the molecule at the center of this entire story, continues to exert its grip on the human brain with the same power it demonstrated to those first shamans in the Andes thousands of years ago. The pharmacology of nicotine addiction is now well understood. When nicotine enters the bloodstream, it crosses the blood-brain barrier within seconds, binding to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors throughout the brain. This binding triggers the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, creating a surge of pleasure and reinforcing the behavior that produced it. It also triggers the release of adrenaline, producing alertness and focus, and it stimulates the release of endorphins, creating a sense of calm and well-being. These effects are powerful but short-lived. Within minutes, nicotine levels begin to drop, and the brain, which has already adjusted to the presence of the drug, begins to signal its absence. The smoker feels irritable, anxious, unable to concentrate. The only solution is more nicotine. Thus, the cycle perpetuates. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year for the rest of the user's life, or until they somehow manage to break free. Breaking free is extraordinarily difficult. Studies suggest that only about 3% of smokers who try to quit without assistance succeed for more than 6 months. Even with the help of nicotine replacement therapy, counseling, and prescription medications, success rates rarely exceed 30%. Nicotine rewires the brain, creating associations between smoking and nearly every activity of daily life: morning coffee, after meals, during stress, during relaxation, with friends, alone. Every one of these associations becomes a trigger, a cue that activates the craving for nicotine. As our story approaches its conclusion, we find ourselves facing a profound paradox. Nicotine is, by any reasonable measure, a poison. It is acutely toxic in sufficient doses. It is powerfully addictive. It has been, indirectly, through the tobacco products that deliver it, the single deadliest substance in human history, responsible for more deaths than any war, any plague, any other self-inflicted harm. Yet, nicotine remains legal almost everywhere in the world. It is sold in convenience stores and gas stations, in supermarkets and pharmacies, to anyone over the legal age, which varies from 18 to 21 depending on jurisdiction. The products that deliver it carry warning labels, certainly, but these warnings are easily ignored. The taxes on tobacco products are significant, but have proven insufficient to deter consumption entirely. The advertising restrictions are extensive, but not total. Why? The answer involves history, economics, politics, and the fundamental nature of addiction itself. Tobacco was established as a legal commodity centuries before its harms were understood. By the time the evidence was undeniable, too many people were addicted, too many economies were dependent, too many governments were reliant on the tax revenue. Prohibition was never seriously attempted because policymakers understood that it would fail, just as alcohol prohibition had failed, just as the bans imposed by Ottoman sultans and Russian czars had failed centuries before. There is perhaps a deeper lesson here, one that speaks to the limits of human rationality in the face of chemical dependency. We like to believe that we are in control of our choices, that we can simply decide to do what is good for us and then do it. Nicotine reveals this belief as an illusion. Millions of people smoke who desperately wish they did not. They know the statistics, they have seen the warning labels, they have watched loved ones die, and still they cannot stop because the molecule has colonized their brains, because the craving is stronger than knowledge, stronger than fear, stronger sometimes than the desire to live. The story continues. At this moment, somewhere in the world, a teenager is trying their first cigarette, drawn by curiosity, by peer pressure, by the lingering glamour that decades of advertising have attached to the act. They do not yet know what they are beginning. They do not know that the pleasant dizziness they feel is the first step on a path that may lead, decades hence, to a hospital bed, to a ventilator, to a coffin. Somewhere else, a middle-aged smoker is crushing out what they have sworn will be their last cigarette, filled with resolve, determined to quit this time for good. They may succeed, most will not. They will try again and again, cycling through quit attempts until either death or breakthrough finally ends the struggle. Somewhere, a researcher is examining new data on nicotine and the brain, looking for better treatments, more effective interventions, some way to loosen the molecule's grip. Somewhere, a policymaker is debating new regulations, new taxes, new approaches to a problem that has defied solution for centuries. Somewhere, a tobacco executive is reviewing sales figures, calculating market share, planning campaigns to reach new customers in parts of the world where the American and European experience has not yet been repeated. The plant that the shamans of the Andes first cultivated 8,000 years ago has become a global presence, woven into economies and cultures, into individual bodies and collective histories. The molecule that Jean Nicot unwittingly gave his name to has touched billions of lives, shortened millions of them, generated wealth beyond imagining, while exacting costs beyond calculation. What does this history teach us? Perhaps that human beings are more vulnerable than we like to believe, more susceptible to manipulation, more easily ensnared by pleasure. Perhaps that profit can overwhelm conscience, that corporations can perpetrate harm on a scale that individuals could never imagine. Perhaps that truth, no matter how thoroughly documented, can be denied for decades when the incentive to deny it is strong enough. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler and more painful. Perhaps it is merely that we are mortal, that we seek comfort in a difficult world, that we will reach for whatever eases our anxiety and our pain, even when that reaching costs us everything. The hour grows late. The smoke of history has cleared, at least for now, revealing the wreckage it has left behind and the path it has taken to reach us here. Tomorrow will bring new developments, new challenges, new opportunities to learn from this long and troubled story. But tonight we rest with what we have learned, carrying this knowledge with us into whatever dreams may come. The story of nicotine is not finished. It continues in laboratories and legislatures, in hospitals and homes, in every convenience store that sells cigarettes, in every vape shop that sells e-liquids, in every field where tobacco still grows. It continues in the bodies of the addicted and in the minds of those who study them. It continues, as all history continues, into a future that remains unwritten. And perhaps, in time, in some future that we cannot yet see clearly, humanity will finally break free from the grip of this ancient molecule. Perhaps future generations will look back on the tobacco era as we look back on the era of bloodletting and leeches, a time when humanity's understanding was incomplete, when we harmed ourselves through ignorance and greed. Perhaps the warnings will finally be heeded, the addictions finally broken, the industries finally held to account. Until then, the most legal poison in human history remains with us, a testament to our frailty, our resilience, and the strange complexity of being human in a world full of dangers, some of which we choose to embrace even as they consume us. The night deepens, the story settles into memory, and somewhere, even now, someone reaches for a cigarette, unaware that they are part of a history stretching back millennia, a history written in smoke and ash, in profit and loss, in lives lived and lives cut short. They light the flame, they inhale the smoke, they feel the nicotine enter their bloodstream, cross into their brain, trigger the cascade of chemicals that defines addiction. They exhale, and the smoke rises, drifting upward and outward, joining the countless plumes that have risen before it, a visible record of humanity's long troubled relationship with a plant, a molecule, a poison that we could never quite bring ourselves to abandon. Rest now. Let the knowledge settle. Let the stories of those who came before us find their place in your understanding. Tomorrow, perhaps, there will be time for action, for change, for whatever contribution each of us can make to a healthier future. But tonight there is only this, the history we have traced together, the truths we have confronted, and the recognition that we are all, in our own ways, participants in a story much larger than ourselves. The most legal poison in human history remains legal still, but awareness is the first step toward change. Knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, and wisdom, perhaps, in time, will show us a way forward, out of the smoke, into cleaner air, toward a future where the shaman's sacred plant no longer claims so many lives. Sleep now. The story will be here when you wake. It has been waiting for 8,000 years. It can wait a little longer.